Great. Well, thanks everyone for the great introductions. It's great to be here and to connect with you and just to hear sort of the variety of perspectives of folks that are here and different experiences. Really excited to get to share a little bit with you all about this paper that I wrote. I thought I'd begin just with a brief sort of territorial acknowledgement. I know we're obviously connecting remotely, and so we're from various different places, but I'm sitting here in my office in downtown Toronto on territory that for thousands of years was the traditional territory of has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and remains home to many Indigenous folks from across Turtle Island today. I'm grateful to be able to come to you from this space and to connect with you all. And I think I also wanted to note, I think in the context of today's discussion, we're going to be exploring and discussing Indigenous ontologies related to our relationship with non-human animals. I think there's added value in acknowledging and paying respect to the Indigenous folks who have stewarded this land and the relationships with the others on it for generations as well. Thank you, Professor Fernandez, for the invitation and for the introduction. As she noted, my name is Adam Iggers. I practice civil litigation here in Toronto. I was born and raised here in Toronto. I live here today with my family. In terms of sort of my path to the law, I was a bit later to the study and practice than many folks. I had a career of about 10 years or so working in the nonprofit sector before I pivoted towards law school. During that time, my work consisted mainly of partnering with First Nations and Indigenous organizations to design and deliver play-based experiential learning programs for children and youth. And I made the decision just before the onset of the pandemic in 2020 to pivot towards law, and I started studying at U of T in the fall of 2020. Former student of Professor Fernandez, as she mentioned, I took her animal law class in my third year of study. I loved it. Peter, I assume that's on your list if you've not already enrolled in it, but definitely a recommendation from me. And it was in that class, as she mentioned, that I put together the paper that I'm going to discuss with you all today. So I thought I would begin with just a bit of sort of background on the paper itself. Professor Fernandez mentioned that I wrote this as a supervised upper year research paper as part of the requirements for the Aboriginal Legal Studies certificate. I mean, given some of my professional background and just my personal interests, I came into law school with a big interest in Aboriginal and Indigenous law, and wanted to pursue that and sort of add to my own knowledge and understanding of sort of how our Western system of laws in Canada interacts with Indigenous laws and how sort of Aboriginal law took shape over the years. So that was already kind of an area of focus for me during the JD, and this the certificate was kind of an obvious fit. And I really I was excited at the prospect of diving into a larger kind of research project that would bring in some of these themes around Aboriginal or Indigenous law, and that's sort of what brought me to the decision to pursue the paper in Professor Fernandez's class. I thought I'd speak just a little bit about sort of how I chose the specific topic that I chose and how I arrived at the sort of position or the argument in the paper. First, I'll say just in the most general terms, and you'll see this on the slide, the sort of core argument in the paper is that first, that there's a tension that exists in the literature, but I think also more broadly and practically speaking in the world, between animal rights and Indigenous rights. And that certain of the proposed resolutions in the literature that I came across fail to give adequate weight or consideration to the Indigenous rights perspective, with significant consequences for both sides. And the tension, in my view, could be better resolved, and the goals of both perspectives, Indigenous rights and animal rights, better served by amplifying certain of the Indigenous ontologies of those human-animal relationships that at times I think come into the crosshairs or can be targeted by scholars within the animal rights perspective or camp. Now, in terms of sort of how I landed at the topic and the process through which the arguments sort of coalesced, like many papers, maybe like most, the particular position of the paper was one that I arrived at over the course of the research that I completed. I didn't begin the process with a clear sense of what I wanted to argue, but rather just a sort of broader set of questions that I wanted to explore, ideas that I wanted to explore, and the specific focus kind of slowly took shape over the course of the research. From the outset, I was interested in exploring questions like how we as humans interact with animals through the food choices that we either make or don't make each and every day, recognizing that that's a vastly diverse space, that folks make all different kinds of choices for all different kinds of reasons, but also being conscious that in the aggregate, that patterns of consumption and choices that people make related to consumption, I think, is at least arguably, if not fundamentally, the most significant channel through which human relationships with animals unfold. And that's something that I get into in some detail in the paper, and I'll speak to a bit more about in a moment. And diving a bit more deeply from there, I was interested in considering this idea of the meat paradox, which is something that we had touched on in Professor Fernandez's course, and this idea of the fetishization of meat as a consumption commodity, and specifically looking at sort of how mainstream meat consumption practices may sit alongside or contrast with indigenous conceptions or approaches or ontologies of the relationship between humans and animals. Now, to be fair, it's going back a few years, I can't quite delineate how many of those ideas were sort of nascent from the outset and how much was sparked as I kind of went through the research, but those were sort of the foundational areas of interest that I think led me on the process. And the process itself, in how I kind of narrowed in and fine-tuned what my sort of position or argument would be, was not linear. It was meandering. It was not efficient. It would it was a couple. Sometimes it would be sort of two steps forward and one step back as I expose myself to kind of the sort of literary and scholarly terrain in that space, and found kind of what fit within the areas of interest and inquiry that I was pursuing, and the argument kind of slowly coalesced. As I was putting notes together and preparing for today, I sort of tried to think through if I had anything more coherent and specific to kind of provide a narrative of that process. And it really was sort of a free-flowing and kind of iterative process of just engaging with the research. It really began with a discussion with Professor Fernandez, sharing some of those initial areas of interest and curiosity that I had, and she provided me with a few resources to kind of get me rolling. And from there, I really just sort of followed the trail of breadcrumbs as I found it throughout the research that I took in. I sort of began what started as a very, very rough outline of just ideas sort of thrown down onto the page and lines connecting different pieces together, and that sort of slowly evolved into a more coherent and clear view of kind of what the position that I would take in the paper would be. So I think, if there is any takeaway for anyone, if any folks are sort of at the beginning of that process of sort of, fine-tuning or sorting out what an area of focus for a large paper will be, I would say just the patience and the time that I spent exploring, and the willingness to really let the ideas and the research kind of be sparked by what I found in the resources I reviewed, was the most significant piece in kind of getting me to where I got, and I think also made for a much more sort of fulfilling process and journey as well. So that brings me into sort of the key substance of the paper, which I'll speak to next. And I thought, as you'll see on the slide, we could do that in sort of four different steps. I'd like to start just with a few kind of key terms, concepts, frameworks, things that I refer to throughout the paper that are sort of fundamental to the position. From there, I wanted to sort of provide a bit more detail and context on this tension that I found between the two perspectives, and how I illustrate that in the paper. Third, the proposals that I sort of provide an appraisal of, a critique of from the literature, as to how that tension might be resolved. And then fourth, my sort of proposed tactical path forward as an alternative means of resolving those tensions. So the first of the key terms I wanted to speak to is this idea of the animal-industrial complex. This is something that I refer to throughout the paper as sort of a key player, or the constellation of players that mediates and shapes the relationship between humans and non-human animals, particularly in the context of mass consumption by humans of animals. This is a term of art that was coined by a Dutch anthropologist and philosopher named Barbara Noske. And it essentially refers to a network of related industries that operate together effectively to reduce animals to inputs of an industrial process, which is aimed at maximizing the consumption of those animals, and that inflicts enormous harm on those animals in the process. And I note also in the paper, early in the paper, that the scale on which the animal industrial complex is operating is vast, is significant. Lauren Camilleri and others are among the scholars cited on that point, whom I rely on for the note that over each year, over 50 billion animals are confined and slaughtered every year by the animal industrial complex. And that was from work published in 2020, which is obviously beginning to feel somewhat dated. I mean, that's some years ago, and so that number could be significantly higher now than it was then as well. The next sort of term or terms that I wanted to lay out at the outset here are the meat paradox and the fetishization of meat. So first, some of this may be familiar to folks on the call, especially given the backgrounds of who's joined us today. But the meat paradox refers to the fact that while it's true that people who feel more empathy towards animals may be less inclined to eat them, that many such people still make the decision to habitually eat meat. And fetishization of meat, to a certain extent, sort of helps to explain the meat paradox, refers to the way in which many folks who eat animals tend to dissociate from the reality that the meat that they eat was once a living and breathing animal. Now, I found in the research that the inverse of this, and this is fairly intuitive, I think, the inverse of this likely also holds true. Lauren Camilleri, who I mentioned, notes that individuals who are high in empathy towards animals are more likely to make the connection between meat and its living animal origins, transforming an inanimate object on a plate into a living entity worthy of moral consideration. However, the animal industrial complex works hard to undermine that connection and to facilitate the dissociation of the consumer or the fetishization of meat as merely a food product severed from its true origins as a living and breathing animal. Jonas Kunst and Sigrid Holl note that culturally entrenched processes of dissociation found in the way that we produce, prepare, and talk about meat and animals sustain people's willingness to eat meat as they make it easy to ignore the meat to animal link. And that people are more likely to dissociate from the truth that meat was once a living and breathing animal when, for example, meat products are more heavily processed. For example, minced chicken versus a whole chicken that more closely resembles the living form of a chicken. When advertisements are scrubbed of any portrayal of a living animal, or when the slaughter of animals is referred to by some more innocuous terms such as harvesting. And also when meat products are referred to not by the name of the animal that they actually are, chicken, cow, or pig, but rather, as poultry or beef or pork. And you'll see there on the slide as well that Bettina Hines and Ronald Lee have done research on how marketing can be used as a tool to, quote, de-animalize meat and to dissociate meat from the lethal process that produces it. And also that commodity fetishism in the marketplace exchange removes the production process from the meaning of meat and thereby silences the slaughter of animals. So that it's a bit of context on the work that is done by the animal industrial complex to sort of sever the connection among consumers between the fact that meat that is eaten comes from living and breathing animals who are slaughtered to enable that. And the third and last sort of topic or framework that I wanted to just touch on before getting into sort of how I framed out my own argument is a framework that I borrowed from a transition studies scholar named Anton Tornberg. This is a framework that is designed to outline how micro-level practices may contribute to revolutionary social change. And in Tornberg's framework, there are 3 levels involved in social change. First are the socio-political regimes, which include not only formal political institutions and organizations, but also institutionalized rules, norms, values, social relations, economic institutions and organizations. The second are what he calls the free spaces, which are a type of, quote, niche, providing an incubation room for new path-breaking innovations that cannot yet compete with the incumbent political structures and norms that are fully integrated in society. And then third, the socio-political landscape, which comprises the wider and relatively stable structural context for both the regime and the niche actors and includes both material and institutional developments but also deep-seated sociocultural factors like established worldviews, ideologies, and values in society. Now, in Thornburg's view, change occurs when strong social innovation fostered in those free spaces, the second of the three levels, is combined with destabilization within an existing socio-political regime. And that when that happens, it provides a window of opportunity for those innovations from the free spaces to scale up and to eventually replace the existing regime. So we'll come back to Thornburg's framework towards the end of the presentation. But from here, I wanted to sort of map out a little bit of the argument that I make in the paper. And at its core, sort of the overarching premise or presumption of the paper, which is woven throughout, is that it is a worthwhile endeavor for us to strive towards what I frame as the shared goals of both the Indigenous rights movement and the animal rights movement, specifically the goal of reducing animal suffering and also challenging settler colonialism. Now, in bringing the tension into focus in the paper, I do this sort of at the outset of the paper by providing sort of two examples of Indigenous assertions of traditional rights that involve killing animals and the responses that each of those assertions were met with. And those are just the two different assertions are, briefly framed out on the slide there. The first was the resurgence in 1999 of the whale hunt among the Mi'kmaq people on the Pacific coast of North America around what is now Washington State. And the second was the recognition and implementation in 2013 of the Haudenosaunee Treaty right to hunt white-tailed deer in an area that is now covered by Short Hills Provincial Park. There are certain similarities between both of the assertions and also the responses. Both assertions of those rights and the exercise of those rights were a source of community pride for the respective communities. They involved the reclamation, the revitalization of culture in certain ways, and they provided sustenance and nourishment for the community. As well, both of the assertions were met with resistance from outside the community on similar grounds. Those included that the practices that they were rooted in were both ecologically harmful and ethically harmful, that Indigenous rights did not justify taking animal lives. And some of this protest took on a racial or a colonial tone, at times using, and this is borrowing from the analysis of Claire Jean Kim, who's sort of a foundational source that I rely on in the paper, a trope of the, quote, ecological Indian as a disciplinary tool to sort of admonish those engaging in these practices, suggesting that Indigenous identity was rooted in little more than adherence to environmental balance, and that identity was being betrayed by those who were taking animal lives. And protesters also accused Indigenous hunters, in response to these assertions, of using cultural traditions as an excuse for cruelty, speciesism, and human supremacy. Now, the two perspectives on this tension from the literature that I provide an appraisal or a critique of come from Will Kymlicka and Sue Donaldson in a chapter that they co-authored in a text, the text Canadian Perspectives on Animals and the Law, and Claire Jean Kim from a specific chapter in her book called Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age. This particular chapter focuses on the resurgence of the gray whale hunt among the Mi'kmaq that I talk about. Now, both of these scholars, they recognize and they deal with and tangle with the same tension that we're talking about in my paper. They recognize that there are problems with the conflict between the two perspectives that need to be resolved, and they propose to resolve the tension through some form of increased engagement between the two perspectives. As you'll see there on the slide, Kymlicka and Donaldson call for a deeper ethical debate rooted in the convergence between the two perspectives. And Kim critiques what she refers to as mutual disavowal by the two perspectives, each of the other, and calls for finding common ground between the perspectives, arguing that, well, it is possible to challenge whaling while also being anti-colonial. Now, my critique of their proposed resolutions is essentially rooted in my view that both of them assume the ethical superiority of the animal rights perspective as against Indigenous rights, or as against the Indigenous rights perspective. And I think in so doing, make sort of a tactical misstep that I'll speak to more in a moment. They both argue that both perspectives can coexist, but upon scrutiny, it becomes clear that this coexistence that they call for really is only so long as any Indigenous practices involving harm to animals and any related or underlying Indigenous ontologies give way to the animal rights perspective. I note that Kymlicka and Donaldson take what I consider to be a reductive view of the significance of Indigenous perspectives and ontologies on the relationship between humans and non-human animals, reducing it to little more than a political choice, which I think, sort of separates it from the significance that goes well beyond any sort of political expression that might be embodied within the ontology and within the practice. And that Claire Jean Kim, of course, recognizes the value of sort of integrating an anti-colonial approach into the resolution. I think still subjugates or subordinates any anti-colonialism to her concerns regarding the whale hunt. And I think, as I mentioned, misses an opportunity to sort of leverage both to greater impact, both in terms of animal rights and Indigenous rights. Now, it's on that point, as I noted, that I contend that their proposed resolutions make a tactical misstep. Some contrary perspectives from the literature that I kind of contrast with Kymlicka and Donaldson and Kim are on the slide there. They come from Darren Chang and from Billy Ray Belcourt. Essentially, that animal protection efforts must go hand in hand with efforts to challenge colonialism, and that colonial infrastructures reinforce and enable the animal industrial complex to persist. And so any efforts to challenge animal suffering or to reduce animal suffering that don't also bring into the crosshairs or bring into focus the capitalist and settler-colonial institutions and power structures that enable that animal suffering to persist will not significantly achieve its goal. Now, the upshot of this perspective, and really the core of my critique of these two proposals from Kymlicka and Donaldson and from Kim, is that if the aim or the strategy is to reduce animal suffering, and to challenge the anthropocentrism and settler colonialism that upholds and enables mass animal suffering, then it makes little sense to continue challenging Indigenous practices that involve the killing of animals, given first, how insignificant the numbers of animals represented by these interactions are, considered in context, and second, that these practices themselves may be a form of political expression that challenges the anthropocentric and colonial power mechanisms that further animal suffering. Now, the Indigenous approaches and ontologies that I focus on in the paper, I think, offer a counterpoint to the fetishization, the dissociation that supports mass meat consumption. In the paper specifically, I look at Mi'kmaq and Kluane perspectives on relationships between humans and non-human animals. That research, or that portion of the paper, is primarily informed by the scholarship of Margaret Robinson, who's a Mi'kmaq scholar from the east coast of Canada, and Paul Nadasdy, as well as others. And there's certain common threads between those two ontologies, in the Mi'kmaq perspective and the Kluane perspective, of the relationship between humans and non-human animals. Those include that they view the human-animal relationship as an intimate, reciprocal, and mutually reliant one that contrasts with those dissociated and fetishized relationships, that there's a foundational connection between people and non-human animals and all things, that the creator's spirit exists in all things, that animals lay down their lives for the hunters, and that hunters are obliged to abide by specific protocol, which is rooted in respect, to reciprocate and to honor the life of the animal. This includes things like the careful treatment of animal bones, which are either used towards some practical purpose or are returned to where the animal had lived and respectfully buried, and also just more broadly conservation and restraint and not taking any more lives of animals than is necessary for sustenance. And finally, that failure to abide by this protocol may cause the animal's spirit to relay this to its living brethren, who would then not permit themselves to be caught or killed. Now, these relationships, intimate, reciprocal, mutually reliant, are in many ways the opposite of the dissociated and fetishized relationships that Kunst and Hole and Hines and Lee spotlighted. Those relationships rooted in dissociation and fetishization create more distance, essentially as much distance as possible between those who are consuming meat and the reality of what it is that they consume. Consumers are encouraged through the marketing that we talked about to disconnect from the lives that are taken to produce their food and from the fact that lives must be taken to produce that food. And by contrast, the Mi'kmaq and the Kluane ontologies of respect and reciprocity include protocol and intimacy that really leaves no space for dissociation or fetishization, that hunters and those who are consuming that meat are required to reckon with the reality that life is given or taken, or both, for their sustenance, to honor that life and to ensure that it's not taken in vain. Now, to map this back onto Anton Tornberg's framework of social change, if we consider the dismantling or the disrupting of the animal industrial complex as the sort of revolutionary social change that Tornberg refers to, we can see how some of these pieces could map onto his framework. Specifically, at the level of the socio-political regime, if we imagine that as the industrial animal complex, the network of industries working together to reduce animals to inputs in an industrial process aimed at their consumption. If we imagine the indigenous ontologies on human-animal relations as something existing in the free spaces, acknowledging, of course, Tornberg's framing of the free spaces involves niche new developments. Of course, there's nothing new about millennia-old indigenous ontologies, but for the sake of understanding how the framework for social change may sort of operate, if we imagine those existing as sort of a counterpoint or a challenging point existing in the free spaces. And then at the socio-political landscape, the mainstream fetishized and dissociated relationships with animals. Again, Tornberg notes that a strong social innovation in those free spaces can contribute to changes in the socio-political landscape that exert pressure on the incumbent regime and reveal vulnerabilities within it. So if we consider indigenous ontologies as noted to be something existing in those free spaces, we can imagine how amplifying them rather than challenging them in the way that Kymlicka and Donaldson and Kim's proposals do, in my view, could help to disrupt the mainstream relationships at the socio-political landscape that are characterized by dissociation and fetishization, and by extension could exert pressure or create vulnerabilities within the animal industrial complex. So really in closing, this is essentially the core position or argument in my paper, that if we seek to foster engagement between these two perspectives on terms that prioritize the animal rights agenda at the expense of indigenous rights, as we saw in Kymlicka and Donaldson and Kim's proposals, we risk furthering the experience of colonialism and domination that indigenous folks and communities have experienced for generations, and also undermining efforts to reduce animal suffering by missing an opportunity to challenge the fetishization and dissociation that buoys the animal industrial complex. But rather, by looking to bring an end rather than looking to bring an end to these indigenous practices, animal rights activists, in my view, should aim, through their engagement with and avowal of indigenous ontologies around animals, to amplify those ontologies in ways that enable them to have their full disruptive effect on the mainstream, fetishized, and dissociated relationship between meat eaters and meat. So that's that. That sort of brings me to the end of the overview. Grateful to folks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions or have any discussion that may have come up.